Go ahead and turn over to 2 Kings chapter 5. That's where we're going to pick up this morning. Last week we finished the last parts of chapter 4, and we began chapter 5. Didn't really get very far. That's more on me because, I just can't help myself. So we only got into one verse, the first verse of chapter 5, where we are introduced to a certain person named Naaman. And who is Naaman? Okay, so he is not an Israelite, as some were saying here. He is from Aram. He is from a hostile nation to Israel here. He is a soldier. He is a valiant soldier. He is so great, in fact, he is the commander of the king's armies. So if you think about, as high as you can get in the kingdom, he's pretty close to the top. He's like maybe one notch under the king, somewhere in that vicinity. He's very close. In fact, we'll talk about kind of his relationship with the king of Ammon, or not of Ammon, I'm sorry, Aram. It's a different country, of Aram, a little bit more. As we get through this chapter. So yes, we have this great, powerful man of a non-Israelite nation, and he's got a problem. What is his problem? He's got leprosy. Why is that a problem? Right. So we know, especially in the old law, there are a lot of rules about, if someone's got leprosy or some kind of skin disease, they're supposed to be exiled from the group until, they're restored, if they ever are. I imagine that the other nations figured this out too, because, they probably figured out, this sick person is next to another sick person. That person wasn't sick before until they came in contact with that person. They probably figured out a lot of those things. So it makes it hard for him to do his job when he's got leprosy. In fact, that would kind of be maybe in this age a forcement of retirement or exile in some fashion. We're not exactly sure how long he has had this leprosy. We're not told that detail. We're also not told how extensive it is. We'll see kind of later on in the chapter. It talks about the spot or the area of his leprosy, which may indicate that maybe it was not all over his body. It was just in one area, so maybe he hadn't had it for very long. That's a little bit of supposition. We don't really know for sure. But this is a problem for him. He is not able to do his duties when he's got this issue. He is going to lose his standing with these things. And of course, his personal health is going to deteriorate quite a bit. That leprosy is a big problem. I think that pretty much sums up that first verse that we went over last week. We had a little bit more detail, but I think we've nailed on the head. Naaman is kind of the focus of chapter 5 here. So as long as we have that and know a bit about him, we know kind of what we're in for as we go through this chapter. Any comments, questions before we move on from verse 1 there? Okay. All right. Well, let's continue on. So I'm going to read for us 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 2 through 5, please.
Now bands from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means, go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing.
Okay. So, verse 2 lets us know that there is, for sure here, there's still hostilities going on between Israel and Aram. There are marauding bands going into Israel from Aram, and we actually have someone who's a bit of a victim of that here, talked about here. So, if there was ever any doubt that these two nations are not friendly with each other, they're not. Like, this is the stuff that's going on. And we're going to get more mentions of these kind of raiding bands from Aram going into Israel. This is not a one-off thing. There's going to be more of these mentioned later on in our study. So we're told of one of these victims of this raid is a young girl of Israel who's captured, and she is enslaved basically to serve Naaman's wife. Now, she does something that's very interesting here. Obviously, she knows about Naaman's affliction because of what she says, but she specifically starts talking about, well, if only he would be able to see this prophet in Samaria, he could be healed. Now, there's a lot of, and that's pretty much most of what we get out of that, but there's a lot of things that we can think about deeper on kind of this young girl, the fact that she's saying this, the fact that she's letting them know about this information, we might be able to glean a few things from it. I think there's a lot that we can really dissect in this. Obviously, she's talking about Elisha here. She's saying the prophet in Samaria. We're talking about Elisha. I mean, Elisha is going to be the one mentioned here. I don't have any doubts that who she's talking about. Now, this either means that she knows about the power of this prophet, specifically Elisha, or she believes in the power of God and what God can do through his prophets. It's not exactly clear how far her faith goes as far as that is. We're not really sure. I tend to think she's got more of a faith in God, but I can't really say that for sure. But it's really interesting because she has no reason to help out Naaman's family in this way. Like, she could have just kept her mouth shut. She could have just said, oh, well, these guys who have really done me a disservice in my life, they're suffering, and you know what? That's on them. That's their problem. You know, this is justified. God is obviously not happy with them. I'm just going to not say anything about what I know could be done to help this man. But she speaks up, and that says a lot about her character. I kind of think of this similar to Daniel, who over and over again is trying to have to help out Nebuchadnezzar in his ways and all of his problems. Joseph would be another good example. Joseph, enslaved in Egypt, he had no reason to, do what was best for his Egyptian captors, but he did so. And, it was actually not just the benefit of them, but also his own family in the long run. There are a lot of interesting things when we look at those kind of comparisons. And we see, going back with the Babylonian example in Daniel, they're told to go ahead and serve the Babylonians faithfully. When you are in captivity to the Babylonians, go ahead and serve them. Jeremiah 27 talks about that very plainly. God is saying, this is my plan. Don't resist it. Serve them in the way that you should. That is going to be for a time. That's the situation you're going to be in. And there are other mentions of it in other places, such as later on in 2 Kings and other places in Jeremiah, where we're told that was their instruction. So I think this is really interesting about her character. She has demonstrated faith in God in saying that there is a prophet in Samaria who can heal him of this. And she is showing, I don't know if it's empathy or just being a good person, I don't know what to call it, is she's trying to help out these people who have really done nothing good for her. They've taken her away, they've enslaved her. She's going to be at the bottom of that social order for the rest of her life probably, but yet she's still willing to help out. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting cues that we can take away from this young girl, even though it's a very brief mention here. Like, do we do the same things in our own life? We don't always necessarily have a boss who is a good, faithful, righteous person, but do we help them in trying to see how that could be a better way? Like, do we speak up? I think that's a really great example here. Even though she's such a, she would be low in the social class, she's still willing to try to do something helpful. I think that's really great. So she talks about the prophet in Samaria. Of course, we know this is Elisha. And Naaman takes this advice and he goes to the king of Aram about it. Now, does anyone remember who the king of Aram is at this time? It's still Ben-Hadad, yeah. And we'll get some clues later on that Ben-Hadad is not exactly in his prime anymore. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But Ben-Hadad is going to be the king still for a little while. And he's going to get off his throne in a couple of chapters, but he's still the king in Aram, even though it's not mentioned by name. My understanding here, time-wise, this is still Ben-Hadad, the same Ben-Hadad that was in the battles with Ahab way back when at the end of 1 Kings. This is the same Ben-Hadad as far as I understand. So he goes to Ben-Hadad, he goes to the king of Aram, and kind of tells him what this Israelite girl had said. And he says, oh, great, this is a great idea. Go down there. I'm going to send a letter ahead to, let the king of Israel know, like, this is why you're here. Bring these things. He has him bring these things with him. Silver, gold, changes of clothing. Probably the purpose of doing this is to offer it as a gift. Maybe not just to, or it's going to be to Elijah directed later in the story, but maybe also to the king of Israel to show this is not a hostile encounter here, where we're trying to be nice, we're trying to be friendly. Here's some money, here's some nice stuff. We'll be in here for a little while, then we're going to leave. Just please don't take this the wrong way, sort of thing. Of course, this is going to be taken the wrong way. We'll get to that in a second. Any other comments, questions on these verses here? Jeff, go ahead.
There were a number of disputed towns along the border between Israel and Syria. And David, I remember, I think it was David was the one who sent an army up there to retake one of the towns that had been in Syrian hands for a long time. I can't remember the name of the town. It's likely that this was one of those disputed towns. And when Israel would go off to fight Ammon down south or something like that, Syria would stroll in and take over the town. And then there were times when Israel would come and take it back. It's likely in one of these raids. I'm not sure it's a marauding group. I suspect it may be Syrian army.
Yeah, I use that term, and that sometimes uses certain implications. Yeah.
To be critical of that. I'm just saying this was kind of an official thing. And so Naaman comes into possession of this girl. The wording that she has in her statement, if only, in my opinion, seems to be saying she cares about him. And that suggests that he was a good man. He took care of he treated her like family. And that is often the case with good masters in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
They would treat their servants like family. And, maybe not in terms of inheritance, but in terms of every day, how they're treated with respect, thank you for what you do, and all those kinds of things. So she had found a home there, and you're right, it suggested a level of great maturity on her part to accept her circumstances. It's possible her parents were dead.
Possibly, yeah.
So like Joseph, Joseph, I don't believe had any idea that he would ever get back to see his family. And so this was, except I guess for the dream that his brothers and parents would bow down to him.
Yeah, but we don't know if he really understood how that was going to work, yeah.
But there's no reason this girl will ever think that she'll see her family again, even if they are alive. But she really cares about him. And you hinted at this idea that we need to, in whatever case God calls upon us to be servants, we need to accept that, embrace that.
Mm-hmm.
This is God's plan for us. We're going to be subject to our boss at work. We're going to be subject to the civil government. We're going to be subject to police and things like that. Wives are told to be in subjection to their husbands. Children are in subjection to their parents. But we need to. There's no reason that subjection needs to be anything less than pleasant and loving. And parents who love their children will not lord it over them in the sense of that expression. Elders are not to lord it over the church,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So in each of these cases, if we are considerate of the other person, the need for the hierarchy of priority and order it's not necessarily a bad thing. In our culture, we want to be independent and boss of everything. Everybody can't be boss. It's just not going to work that way. And she had accepted this, and we, I think, by implication, are to accept whatever roles God puts us in to serve. The greatest in the kingdom is the servant, Jesus said in Matthew 20. And so we are looking for where God wants us to serve and willing to cooperate in a good way. You won't always be treated right.
No.
Peter says that people treat you harshly for Christ's name's sake. Don't think that's strange. That's going to happen from time to time. And know that what you're suffering is the same thing Jesus suffered. Jesus submitted to the circumstances he was under to fulfill God's will. And that's what we do. But this is kind of a beautiful picture, this
Yeah.
This
It's such a small thing, but yeah.
so much good that's reflected in other Bible passages.
Yeah, because, she doesn't say anything. None of what we're about to read happens. And we can only suppose what would happen to Naaman after that. And I do kind of like to, and we don't know because we don't know a lot of information about this situation, but I like to think that it's hopefully similar to Joseph and Potiphar's relationship when, Joseph was enslaved, but he was treated right by Potiphar. Potiphar saw that he was a good worker. He was devoted to his work, and he made him the head of the house. He had him take care of everything. He was the highest servant in the household. He gets a problem that's not his fault with Potiphar's wife. But then Joseph doesn't say, well, it doesn't matter. I shouldn't, ever try again. When he's in jail, he's working his way up again. He's on good terms with the warden there, and the warden puts him in charge of making sure everything's going right. And, eventually he gets to the point where he's second in command of Egypt. And we kind of think that, well, that's amazing. That would never really happen in real life, except, well, it did. Obviously God had a huge hand in that. But if Joseph had not that attitude, did not look at doing things that way, he would have never had that opportunity. That would have never happened. There's so much that we can think about with this small interaction, even though we don't have a lot of information about it. I think that's it's a good thing to keep in mind, absolutely. And Jeff, you also mentioned kind of the geopolitical situation. We just read a couple chapters ago about the rebellion in Moab, and they all went down there. And there's been constant fighting between Aram and Israel. Ahab. We're going to have more that are going to be almost exactly the same. We're like, didn't we read this before? Didn't this already happen? Yes, but it's a new generation. They have the same problems. This hostility is not going away. So it's incredibly amazing that, noting that there's so much hostility between these nations, we're still going to have this interaction here in chapter 5. So a lot of this is quite incredible as far as that goes. Any other comments on these verses up to this point? All right, very good. Let's continue on. Someone read for us verses 6 through 9, please. 6 through 9.
Then he brought a letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. So it was, when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So we kind of mentioned here that last part that we were reading that the king of Aram was going to send a letter to the king of Israel, kind of explaining the situation, kind of make everything good and understand what was going on. Because who is Naaman again? What's his standing? What's his job? Yeah, he is the commander of the armies of Aram or Syria, depending on your translation. And he's coming to Israel. So you just have that look alone seems hostile. You have the commander of the armies coming into your nation. It's like, well, what's this guy doing here? This would not typically be a diplomatic party here if it's the commander of the armies. And the letter here we see in verse 6, and maybe it could have been better written, I'm not sure. But the letter says, with this letter, I'm sending my servant Naaman to you so you may cure him of his leprosy. And this is not taken well, even though I think the intention of this letter is to make it seem like this is not a hostile thing. We're here to, help Naaman. We're looking for your help. The king of Israel does not take this well. Now, it doesn't mention his name here, but who is the king of Israel at this time? Does anyone remember? Joram, yeah. So not the oldest son of Ahab, but the next one after the oldest son died. So we've actually talked about him already. Same guy. I believe he's still in power at this point. We haven't seen his demise quite yet in 2 Kings. So he takes it very, very badly because he thinks that he has been asked the impossible. He's like, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to cure this man of his leprosy? Am I God? Can I even do this? And this is not the only time that the king of Israel, Joram, does this. He says very similar things in chapters after this. And obviously he's not getting it. He's got the same problems as Ahab. And he takes this as the king of Aram looking for a fight here. He's given me this impossible task, and when I'm not going to be able to do it for him, he's going to use this as a justification for war. Because look, this is his commander of his armies, and I'm not going to help him, and he's trying to get a quarrel with me. He's trying to get a casus belli here to start another war, which, if you think about it, that seems like a very likely thing given the dynamic between these two nations. I don't really hold that against him when he thinks about it that way, except for the fact that he's kind of forgotten that, there's a prophet of God here who really could do this. He doesn't think of that idea. Who suggests that to him, that he should be sent to Elisha? Elisha. Elisha hears about this because the king has torn his clothes. Elisha hears about this, and he sends word to the king, have him sent to me. Why are you in this distress? We can take care of this. Have you forgotten? I'm right here. We've interacted before even. You know what I can, what God is able to do through my hands. And so Elisha has to make the suggestion, which is incredible to think that is Joram dense, or is he just so far removed from his relationship to God that he doesn't even think about that? It's not exactly clear, but the king of Israel did not take it well, but luckily Elijah is going to smooth things out for them. And I think one thing I want to point out about what Elisha says here, it's the end of verse 8, when he's sending his message to the king of Israel. The last thing he says, have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. I want you to remember this phrase because I'm going to bring it up later in this story. But this is sort of the reason he gives. Have him come to me so that he will know there is a prophet in Israel. Just put a bookmark there in your mind. We're going to come back to that. I'm not going to go too much into it yet, but please remember that. So I'll give you a little sneak peek, though. This is not just an outward sign that this is for the people of Israel, but it's going to be for a non-Israelite here, and that's going to have some very interesting implications here. So Naaman does go. He's got sort of a convoy here. It talks about his horses, his chariots. It's not just him by himself on foot, walking on. He's got an entourage here. He's got a whole bunch of people with him. He's got all that stuff. He's got to carry all these gifts he's brought with him. He's got a group with him. So they all go to Elisha's house, and where we stopped, he's at the door of Elisha's house. That's where he is at the end of verse 9. He's there. He's at the door. He's right there. So we'll see how this goes down in the next section. Just a second. Any comments, questions before we move on to verse 10 onward here? Jeff.
Joram is out of the loop.
Oh, yeah.
And that is unfortunate. You would think that if he gave any thought to the man, to the prophet of God, that it would occur to him that something supernatural needs to take place. Maybe it's got something to do with Elisha, and he can contact him. But we do this too. We come to church and we sing songs and we listen to the preaching of the Bible, and then we go home and we put our Bibles on the shelf and we don't read our Bibles. I'm talking about a lot of people anyway. And we don't read our Bibles like we should, and we don't pray like we should. And so when things happen in this life, and God is there, we could pray to him at any moment, but we're so disjointed from our spiritual nature
That's not his fault.
Turkey doesn't know any better. But people ought to know better. So give God some thought Monday through Saturday, continually, and your horizons will open up. The possibilities will be clear to speak a word, a prayer to God, and then see what his answer might be. It doesn't mean that we don't try to solve the problems we're faced with. Yes, we do. But he can't solve this. And we're going to run into problems we can't solve. And we need to talk to God about those things. But we have to have him on our minds in a sense, at least in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. Jorm does not have this kind of relationship with God that he should. And I mean, this is something we can think about, and you've kind of talked about it a little bit. The church, the relationship of the church and the people of it to Jesus is supposed to be like that of a married couple. I mean, the New Testament uses that analogy a lot. Now, for those of you who know how that relationship works, if you talk to your spouse maybe once a week for maybe an hour and that's it, that's probably not going to be as strong a relationship as it could be and maybe should be. And Joram is probably very far removed. I mean, we've already talked about how he's been going after the idols, not as bad as Ahab, but he's still going after idols. He's not really interested in serving God. We saw earlier in chapter 3, when they're all going out to fight against the rebellion in Moab, he's out there in the desert and with his allies, and Elisha is there. Why he's there, we're not told. We talked about that already. But Elisha said he wouldn't even give Joram the time of day if it wasn't for Jehoshaphat also being there, because Joram is so far removed from his relationship to God that God is not really so nice with Joram, because Joram has gone off on his own. He's doing his own thing. And here it seems that God is giving Joram a little bit of mercy, because obviously Joram is not figuring this out on his own. So Elisha hears about this. And again, I don't think this is, and I kind of mentioned it just a brief second, this is not really for Joram. This is more for Naaman. And that's going to kind of be a very interesting dynamic that we'll have a lot to talk about. Any other comments up to this point? Okay. I'm going to try to hurry up a little bit. I don't even know if I'm going to finish, y'all. Sorry. Let's read. Someone read for us 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 10 through 14, please. 10 through 14.
And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, Wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean.
Okay. So a really interesting thing, just to start off with this section, Elisha does not actually talk to Naaman himself at this point. He sends a messenger, or some translations will say he sent a servant to talk to him. And, even though Naaman is literally at his doorstep, Elisha just have to get up and walk a few steps and say hello, He's not going to do that. And I don't think this is Elisha being mean. I think this is God trying to prove a point here to Naaman. So he sends out a servant to give instructions to Naaman. And we're not told who this messenger servant is that Elisha sends to him. I have a guess, though, and I think it's a pretty decent guess. I think it's Gehazi. We've talked about him. He's been the servant to Elisha. We talked about him in the last chapter. He's actually going to be mentioned by name here later. It would make sense for him to be the one that does this. Again, we're not for certain told that is him, but I would not be surprised if it's Gehazi here, because that would make the most sense. So I'll just put that as a bookmark, because we're going to talk about him a little bit later anyway. So whoever it is, the servant of Elisha tells Naaman, go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and you're going to be cleansed. You're going to be restored. Everything's going to be good. And we see that Naaman is really very much upset about how this is played out. This is not what he expected. We're told what he thought was going to happen. First, he thought that Elisha would come out in person instead of sending someone out the door to meet him. Even though he's right there, he could just come out and talk to him. It's not an inconvenient thing. But Elisha did not give him. In fact, this might be seen as a sign of disrespect. Here's a person of great status, of great power, and you're not even going to come out and talk to him yourself. You're going to send your little errand boy. Like, what are you doing? Some people would take that in a very bad way. Then he thought that Elisha would call in the name of the Lord. He'd wave his hand over the spot of leprosy, and that would be it. He'd be cured. He'd be cleansed. Everything would be good. But he's been told to wash in the Jordan, and he doesn't like this because, not only was this not what he had in mind, but he thinks back to the rivers of his homeland back in Damascus. He says, well, aren't those superior rivers? Why can't I just go to those? Why do I got to go to this Jordan River over here? What's the difference? Why can't I just be cleansed in those? So he's really upset. He's incensed. He's angry. He heads off in a rage. And for all of his faults, and I think he does have some, they're obvious here, at least at this point, Naaman has surrounded himself, I think, with pretty good people. We talked about the servant girl earlier who spoke up at the beginning of this story. And then we have another servant that he has here who we don't know anything about, just says the servant of Naaman, who addresses Naaman respectfully. And he tells him that, we would have done, you would have done something if you were asked to do something great and some great feat or something, you would have done that. Why not at least do this little thing? And it seems like a very reasonable, very rational thought process. Again, we don't know exactly how strong this relationship between the servant and Naaman is, but he's very respectful of him. He calls him father. Many of your translations, a very respectful tone. And he's not saying, you're being dumb here. Like, why would you do this? He's saying, you would do great things. Let's at least try. Let's just see. What do you got to lose, in essence? I think it's a very good way of addressing, and this could be a risky thing when your great and powerful master is in a fit of rage to talk to them. They might see you talking to them and say, well, like, I'm mad, so you're dead, or something like that. And he would have the power to do that. So this servant is taking a little bit of a risk here. So I think it's really good that Naaman has people around him that are willing to be, a little bit more reasonable and helpful to him. And so Naaman hears the servant out. Again, he's in a rage here, but he hears out his servant. He sees the reasoning and the rationale here too. And he does go to the Jordan River. He does dip down 7 times. And just as Elisha said, his leprosy is cured. His skin is restored. And the description we get is not just the spots of leprosy are gone or the area is cured, but all of his skin is like that of a young man or a young boy, depending on your translation. It's not just the leprosy's gone, as your skin, your whole body has been cleansed and restored in a way that is clearly miraculous, would never be able to happen otherwise. He tried it, and guess what? It works. How about that? And again, remember, this is a non-Israelite. He doesn't seem to necessarily have any interest in the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, any of that. He's not been brought up with that. But he's willing to try. He's willing to go through it. He's maybe heard things, maybe through the servant girl, maybe in other instances where the God of Israel has done things. And even though it's not really the way that he thought it would work out, the servant convinces him, let's go ahead and try. And he has at least enough faith to go ahead and try it. And, well, lo and behold, he's healed. Any comments up to verse 14? Go ahead, Jeff.
Again, we see Naaman's the kind of person who will listen to his servants.
Yeah.
And that's just a really remarkable trait that a person could have. You also see someone in Naaman, who is not concerned about what other people think. Okay, he goes to his king and then brings this letter to the king of Israel about being healed of leprosy and by a prophet of God, and he has no way of knowing that such a prophet exists except that little girl said so.
Yeah, it's kind of hearsay almost.
And now he's told to go. He's already made a little bit of a display of anger when Elisha didn't come out and strike his hand over there. So everybody's seen that. Now his servant comes He didn't worry about any of that. What he cares about is the truth. He cares about reality. And that's a very strong quality. You'll find the truth, that's what you care about.
Yeah.
But if you care about what other people think of you, then it will be very difficult for you to find the truth.
Naaman seems like a very practical person and someone who is not overly prideful. Despite the fact he is in a very high position, if he was full of pride and hubris, he's not going to listen to this servant. I mean, if anything, that servant's dead because he's bothering him while he's mad. When we've seen that with Nebuchadnezzar, where Nebuchadnezzar got fed up with all of his wise men and says, well, you're all going to die now. And like, how does that help you, Nebuchadnezzar? How does that make anything better? It doesn't, but we've seen, in our study of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar had a real pride problem, and it took a long time for that to get torn down. But here, Naaman doesn't seem to have quite the same issue that Nebuchadnezzar does. So he's willing to hear out the servant and go ahead and do it.
Well, one other thing.
Go ahead.
When we come to God, we don't need to have a preset set of expectations. It's human nature to expect certain things, and that's okay. But they need to be malleable. They need to respond to what we find out the truth to be. Because if our expectations are too set, then we can't change.
Yeah, we cannot be closed-minded in how we think God should operate. And that's what we do because, we obviously don't have the foresight and the knowledge that God has, but we might pray to God for something to happen. And, sometimes the answer is no, and that's probably for the betterment of us. We don't necessarily need everything we ask for. But sometimes when we ask for something, there might be a little bit of a trial until we get there, or it's going to come in a fashion that we don't expect, or God's going to do it at a different time. Maybe it's not now. Maybe it's later. Maybe it's even later than that. We are not. We don't really have the authority to dictate to God what He should do for us. I think we all understand that. And so when God does something a little bit differently than we hope for, even though we might get a little upset or impatient about it, we need to understand that God doesn't do this because He's mean or because He doesn't like us. Anything He does for us is for our own good. Now it may not feel great at that particular moment, especially if it's a hardship that we're trying to get through. But maybe God has a bigger plan that we just don't understand. And I always think Habakkuk is a great example of that. Habakkuk didn't really understand what God was doing, and he prayed to God, and he says, God, why are you doing this? Isn't this worse? And God basically has to break it down to him and says, you don't see what I see, you don't know what I know, but you're going to have faith in me. And Habakkuk kind of, at the end of that book, he kind of relents and says, I understand, God, you're doing something. I don't get it, but I'm just going to leave it in your hands. And we see other examples of that. I think Job has got something similar going on. He doesn't understand why all these things are happening to him, but there's something bigger at play. We don't always understand, but that's okay. We just got to have that faith that God is going to get us through those things. And in the end, that will be to our betterment. Any other comments, thoughts, questions? We're going to actually have to stop here. Amazingly, I've run out of time. I don't know how that keeps happening. So we're going to stop here, Naaman being restored. That is not the end of the story, though. For all those of you who can see, there's more to chapter 5. We're obviously not done here. There's a bit more that we do need to talk about with this story. Not all of it is necessarily about Naaman. Some of it is going to be kind of us talking about Gehazi a little bit, and I've alluded a little bit to some of the issues he may have a couple of weeks ago when we were in chapter 4. But we're going to talk about these men and how they kind of are situated at the end of chapter 5. So we'll finish chapter 5 next week. We may start chapter 6 next week. So if you haven't already, go ahead and start reading chapter 6. I assume we're going to at least finish chapter 5 next week. But we'll stop there. We'll pick up at verse 15 next week. Thank you.